Okay, so in the previous video we discussed the three different categories of electrophiles that we're going to be adding across carbon-carbon multiple bonds, such as alkenes and alkyne nucleophiles. Um, so now in this lecture, what I want to do is now discuss some vocabulary that's going to allow us to describe chemical reactions and their selectivity. And the first is regioselective. So a regioselective reaction is one where one structural or constitutional isomer product is favored over another. In other words, the reaction is selective for the region of the alkene molecule to which the hydrogen will add versus the chlorine will add. If a reaction gives two different structural isomers in equal amounts, then it is not regioselective. But if it gives a distribution of 90 to 10%, two different structural isomers in unequal amounts, it is regioselective. So we know that this electrophile is a strong acid.